In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to build the best sub $800 gaming PC build for 2022. This is a system that's future-proofed against any new GPU releases, more on that later, and provides top-tier performance. More than 100 frames per second in Fortnite, over 60 FPS in all of the latest titles at 1080p high settings, and over 75 frames per second in Warzone. This is a build you don't want to sleep on. I'll be walking and talking you through all the components that make this build possible, why I've gone ahead and selected the parts that I have, and how to put it together. Let's do this. The Corsair iCUE 5000T provides the ultimate in airflow, RGB lighting and mounting compatibility for PC builds in 2022. With 3 alloy fans included, 160 addressable RGB lights in the front, roof and floor panels, Corsair have really taken things up a notch. Learn more about the awesome 5000T in our build videos over on the channel or at the where to buy links in the description below. Let's kick things off by taking a look at the CPU, motherboard and memory first of all. These are 3 components we can go ahead and get out the way straight away. Easy parts to assemble all together outside of our case. Now for this build, I've gone for the ASUS Prime B660A D4. ASUS's Prime range are famed for providing more entry-level options at great prices that still deliver you the performance you've come to know and expect from these B660 chipsets. We've actually written a full review of this motherboard over on our website, which we'd urge you to check out. With PCIe Gen 4 for your SSD and GPU, a solid rear I/O and 4 RAM DIMM slots, it covers all the bases nicely. Perhaps most crucially, it also supports, of course, our Intel Core i3-12100F CPU. With 4 of Intel's latest performance cores and 8 threads, this thing is ready for business. In fact, Intel's new i3s are so good, they actually rival some of AMD's Ryzen 5 options. That makes them a stellar choice, and to be honest with you, leaves us recommending Intel far more than AMD, at least at the moment. Ryzen 7000 is of course rumoured to be dropping very soon, something we'll be keeping our ear to the ground on, and of course bringing you reviews of when it does finally land. In terms of the RAM or the memory for this build, a 3600 MHz kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB RS is going to do the business. 16 gigs of RAM is a must in 2022, 32 is great for higher end builds, but plainly overkill for a system of this budget. We're going to pop it into the grey, not the black RAM DIMM slots on the motherboard. That will of course give us that lovely dual channel performance and the extra bandwidth afforded to us by having 2 RAM DIMM slots. While we've got the motherboard out, I'm going to go ahead and also install the cooler, but first install the storage for this build. I've gone perhaps slightly higher end than you could get away with Samsung's SSD 980. Not the Pro, not the Evo, just the bog standard 980. I'll pop some speed tests on your screen now, but with about 3 GB per second on the read, this is going to do the job really nicely. It's going to provide fast Windows boot up speeds, slightly lower write speeds, but that's absolutely fine for this system, where we're going to be reading far more data than we're going to be writing. Go ahead and unscrew your M.2 heatsink. This is going to help to keep the drive nice and chilly and add a slightly better aesthetic edge to the build today. With this off, we can then slide our drive in sort of at a 45-degree angle before pushing it down and securing it into place. We don't need to use a screw to actually pop it in, as our heatsink and heat shield will do that job for us. Tighten your screws down and your drive has got all the data, all the power and connectivity it needs. When it comes to cooling in this build, you have got a few options. A liquid cooler is plain overkill, so write that out now. Any money you'd spend on that kind of cooler would be better spent on a more powerful CPU or more powerful GPU. That's going to give you way more performance. The other option is an Intel stock cooler. It comes included with your CPU for free, but it will make the processor run a bit warm, it's a bit ugly, and it's going to be louder because the fan is smaller. If you're on a super budget, I'd recommend sticking with the stock cooler. It will work a-okay. But a design like this Cooler Master Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition comes in at around like the $30–35 mark. Latest pricing and availability availability, as always, will be linked at the affiliate links in the description. With a large heatsink and a much larger fan, this is going to do a far greater job of keeping the CPU cool. And Cooler Master's 212 range has always been known as the best budget air cooler on the market. Plus, the RGB will also look nice and sync up with the rest of our build for an awesome aesthetic. What we need to do here is grab our backplate, and with the scaffolding side, as I call it, compared to the completely flat side, facing towards the bottom of the motherboard, we're going to slide this through the 4 holes around our CPU. If we simply pop the backplate on like so, and then we're going to sort of hold it into place while we lay the board flat on the motherboard's box. That will then keep the backplate in place, and we can tell that it's worked because you can see these 4 silver standoff posts around the processor. They're actually pointing out through the backplate. We then need to pop these female to female stoppers over the posts around the CPU. You do get an included tool in the box to make this bit a bit easier, but often you can just tighten these up with your fingers. What these are going to do is then allow us to have holes to actually secure the CPU cooler into in a moment. Before doing that, add the correct brackets on, that's these short and stubby ones, to the bottom of the cooler, and then screw the whole thing in. We'll be adding the fan back onto the cooler later. You've got to remove it now because you can't access the screws otherwise to secure it all down. Remember a drop of thermal paste as well if you have used the cooler before and it doesn't have any pre-applied. Nice and easy. Once this stage is all complete, the motherboard assembly, as it's often called, is now finished, and we can go ahead and move this over into the case for this build. Now, we've covered a range of cases here on the channel and even made a roundup video and an article discussing the best 10 cases you can buy right now. The Cooler Master TD500 mesh is perhaps a little overkill for this build, but I like the way it looks. It's also fairly inexpensive, and you get 4 120mm fans included as standard. That's going to make a massive difference to airflow and temperatures, and it has support for any water cooling or GPU upgrades you might want to make later down the line. Earlier, I did say this build was sort of future-proofed against new GPU releases, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the case is big enough to fit larger cards if that's what we're looking for, but also second of all, the 3050 GPU is not set to be replaced for at least another year. AMD and Nvidia will always start with their high-end cards first. It's just the way it works for a number of complex reasons like yield, profit margin, and scaling manufacturing production. That means this build is not likely to be out of date anytime soon, as the budget cards are always the ones to come last. The little brother to this case, the TD300 mesh, is a good option, but to be honest, the 500 is way better built and a little bit bigger. I don't want to sound like a broken record, because if you've watched a GeekaWhat video before, you've heard me say this line, but what you need to do with any case is take off as many of the side panels as possible now, as that will make installing the rest of your components a lot easier. First of all, we're going to take the back panel off, followed by the front panel, which appears to be missing a screw. I don't know where that's gone. We'll have to find that later before we go ahead and power the system up, and then we can lay the case down flat on its back, a little something like so. Now, one quirk of using a slightly larger case with a slightly smaller motherboard is your standoffs. Now, as you can see, this case has got 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom. That's actually going to be different to the standoff holes on our motherboard. The holes we'll be using to secure this into this. We've got 3 at the top here, they're all okay, and the 3 in the middle are also in the right places. But these 2 down the bottom are not going to match up. What that means is we need to add 1 in here and 1 in here. Remove standoffs from the bottom of the case to do this, then go ahead and install the I/O shield. This is included with your motherboard, and screw the whole thing into place. It's not too complicated, and we can also add back on our CPU cooler fan at this stage to really start rounding off the aesthetic of the build. Next up, we can go ahead and install the GPU. This right here is ASUS's RTX 3050 dual design. Now, ASUS have got a range of different 3050 cards available, including the Strix model, which we first looked at when 3050 launched back in, I want to say like January or February. This is still a relatively new card as far as hardware releases go. The 3050 released in a very different climate to where we are now. Back then, those high-end 3-fan expensive cards were all you could really buy. Now, the more simple, better value coolers like these are readily available. Prices are still falling as well, and I'd expect cards like this only to get cheaper. What we're going to do is we're going to install it into the very top slot of our motherboard, and if we just hover the graphics card in, we can see here that the top slot is in the way. We need to move the top slot down to the bottom here to make way for the graphics card. We'll do that, click the GPU in, and then give it power with our power supply, which is the next component on the list. This is the Cooler Master MWE 650 Gold V2. Now this is going to be an awesome unit for powering up the system. It's got about 100 watts of capacity more than our 3050 technically needs, but extra wattage is never going to be a bad thing. Plus it's fully modular too, meaning we only need to plug in the cables that we actually need to plug up to our system. There's a few different cables we need to install, the first of which is this one. It's a 24-pin motherboard power cable. We're also going to go ahead and plug in one of these, this right here. Oh, if I can even keep hold of it, is a 4+4 pin or 8-pin CPU power connection. We're also going to pop in one of these 6+2 pin harnesses. There's actually two 6+2 pins on this cable for our GPU. And then finally, lastly, we're going to plug in a SATA power connection. This is going to enable our RGB and any fan hubs to work. We haven't got any SATA drives, but if you do, that's what you'll be using to power those up. Plug all of those up to the power supply, screw the PSU into the rear of the case, and then connect your motherboard cable first up to the right-hand side of the motherboard, CPU second to the top left-hand side, your GPU to your graphics card, and then any SATA power cables later. To polish things off, we're also going to plug in a couple of the front panel cables. These are the connections which power all the ports on the top of the case. USB 3 is first, it's the largest of all of these, it's notched, and it has this kind of rubber sealed cable. We're also going to add in our HD audio connection. This goes to the bottom left of the motherboard, has a pin blocked out, and makes our headphone and mic jacks work. Finally, we've also got our JFP1 connections, our power, reset switches, all that jazz. They go to the bottom right hand corner of the motherboard and can be a bit fiddly. If you get them the wrong way around, don't worry too much. Simply go back again, adjust, and that should fix things nice and easily. Next up, we're going to turn the PC on to see how good it looks in an awesome GeekaWhat montage, and then roll through to take a look at performance and benchmarks in all of the latest titles. Nicely done. We've gone ahead and put the system together, but the important question as to whether the PC actually performs at the level we need is yet to be answered, and that's what we're going to look at now. We've tested this build on a wide range of the latest titles, everything from GTA 5 to Battlefield 2042, Warzone, Fortnite, Apex, Valorant, and more, so you guys can see what sort of numbers are achievable. But don't go anywhere, because we'll be diving into some of these titles, our focus titles, in a bit more detail. Let's begin by looking at Battlefield 2042, working our way through to Fortnite and Apex later with a few juicy games in the middle. In Battlefield 2042, we tested at 1080p, high settings, with DLSS enabled and set to performance mode. We pulled in 86 frames per second on average, with strong 90 and 99 percentiles too. The game looked awesome, and we gathered our frame rate data with NVIDIA FrameView and MSI Afterburner's Reaver Tuner. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 next up, here we tested at 1080p high in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode. A flagship title, what kind of frame rates might you expect from an entry-level GPU and a budget build like this one? 40? 50? 60? No! We got over 90 frames per second on average. 93 frames to be precise, with 87 and 77 for the 90 and 99 percentiles for good measure. And the great results carried on through into Halo Infinite, where at 1080p high settings, the good news keeps on coming. 82 frames per second on average, with 90 and 99 percentile results that never drop below 70 FPS. And people are saying the 3050 is somehow poor value. A $299 GPU, prices of course subject to change, rocking these kind of results in the latest titles is awesome. Moving on to Apex Legends next up, and here we got over 120 FPS. In fact, we were closer to 130. The 90 and 99th were good too, and if you wanted esports level frame rates nearing the 200 mark, you could tune down to 1080p low settings with no problem in the world. Something which we did in Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings. Here we got 174 frames per second on average, with those settings tuned down to low and our render distance set to far, creating an awesome, incredibly competitive gaming experience. Finally, to wrap things up, we also tested out a bit of COD Warzone. More popular than Vanguard, I mean understandably so, and here we achieved just shy of 90 FPS on average. 86 to be precise. We got 78 and 70 for the 90 and 99 percentile results too, and we're really impressed with the performance of this budget but fantastic system. NVIDIA have created a card with the 3050 truly capable of incredible 1080p gaming that's consistently top notch.